Today I'm going to show you a few watercolor techniques. Some will be wet on dry and some will be wet on wet. The first step is sectioning off your paper into 12 sections. At the top, I have the dry surface techniques. And I'll create 6 sections. And at the bottom, I have the wet on wet or damp surface techniques. With 6 sections also. I will demonstrate some of the dry surface techniques first. And I'm going to start with a stipple on a wash. And I need the watercolor wash to dry first, so I will paint these sections first. This one will be scratching on a wash. With watercolor, there are a few different types of brushes. There are big, thick brushes called mop brushes, and these are really good for soaking up a lot of water to create a wash. We've got some round brushes. And you can see the ferrule, the metal part is round all the way around. And then we have a flat brush, which is thinner on one end and wider on the other end with the ferrule. The mop brushes are great for showing washes. And so what I'm going to do is take my watercolor, add some water into the palette of the colors that I want to use. You can choose any colors you want for this demonstration. I'll just pick a couple. And you'll want to swish the water around to get the watercolor ready to go. I'll start with my first wash, gently brushing the brush along the paper. And then I'll do a different color for the other wash. Depending on how much water you have, your wash will look lighter or darker. As I'm letting these dry, because it's wet on dry surface techniques, I will demonstrate the other dry surface techniques. If you have a dry surface or your paper is dry, what you can do is simply take your brush and choose a color for your round brush, and you will create round brush lines. Experiment with moving your brush in different ways, in different directions, and using different sides of the brush to show different textures. You can see that the water stays very contained with where you put it on the paper. And as long as you have less water, you have more control over what happens with your paint. The next one is going to be flat brush lines. And instead of using the round brush, you'll use the flat brush. And test out having more water on your brush, and as you work your way over, let your brush dry out and you'll see a lot of texture. You can see that as my brush got drier and drier, you can see more lines. And I actually dried it a little bit on a paper towel, and I can really see more texture if I dry my brush a little bit. So depending on how much water you have, this would be great for a wooden texture to show the grains of wood if you work with a drier brush. The next technique is spattering or splatter painting. And for this one, I like using a flat brush, and I'll dip the brush in the paint and just gently flick the bristles. And you'll get a splattering look. If you do it on a dry surface, the spattering stays exactly where you place it on the paper, where it ends up on the paper. The last one I'll show is the Crayon Resist for the dry surface techniques. And what I can do is take a crayon and draw lines and designs on it, either with a crayon, a colored pencil, either white or colored. You can see that the crayon and the colored pencil, because they're wax-based, they resist the watercolor, so they show through after you paint it over. Now that my 2 washes that I created for my dry surface techniques are almost dry, I'll show you the 2 other techniques you can use. Make sure your paper is dry, whether it's just clean paper or you let your wash dry. And the next one is the stipple on the wash. What you can do is take your brush and dip it in the paint without too much water on your brush, just a little bit of water. And you can dot the brush or stipple it on top. And you can also dry off your brush a little bit too if you want more texture. And I'm just going to press it up and down gently to show some different textures. So this is stippling. For scratching into the wash when your paper is dry, you can take a sharp tool and scratch lines and textures into your wash, and it will reveal the white paper. If your paper is more dry, you'll have cleaner lines and less ripping of the paper. So these are a few different dry surface techniques, and now we'll move to the damp surface techniques, or the wet on wet. The wet on wet means you have wet paper and you are painting with wet watercolor on top of that wet paper. So in order to do that, each section you'll have to paint with a wash first. My first example will be round brush on damp paper. I'll start with using my mop brush and painting on top. And I'm just going to paint a wet wash with clear water. And then I'll take my round brush, choose a color, and paint lines on that. This section bleeds together and blends together a lot more as opposed to the dry surface technique, where it's a lot more controlled with crisp edges. You can also just do a simple wash of color. And I'm going to use 2 colors that will blend together or show a gradient. For my wash to start with, I'm going to take my mop brush and paint some water on top. And I will use my flat brush to start with one color on one end and then blend with another color on the other end. And I'm going to choose colors that I know will make a pleasing color when they mix together. Here I have the orange, and I painted in strokes to the right, and then I took red and painted in strokes to the left to cause them to blend together. Next is the salt technique. And for this one, you'll want to start with a wash of a color. And this technique works really well for night skies. So I'm going to take a darker blue, maybe with a little bit of black. And depending on how long I let it dry, I'll sprinkle some salt on right away. And I'll sprinkle on a little bit more once it dries, and we'll see the difference. and then you let your paper dry before you remove the salt. The last 3 techniques we have for the next one, masking tape. And for this one, it's similar to the crayon resist, where I'm sectioning off areas that I don't want to be painted. So I will take some masking tape and place it on my paper before I wash, or I could paint a color down, let it dry, then put the masking tape over top, and then remove the masking tape. So I could have 2 colors. But for now, for this one, I will just have the white paper underneath. Then I can take my brush and paint a color over top. And you can remove the masking tape pretty soon after you paint your surface. I will peel one off right now. And you can see that the masking tape resists the watercolor. For this next one, I am going to lift out the color or blot it. And this is great for clouds. So I'm going to start with my wash. And you can take your paper towel and you press it against the wet paper and it will lift out and blot out the color. You can see that I'm lifting out some of the color and it reveals the color underneath, or the white paper. The last technique is a wash blotted with a sponge. And instead of lifting out my color with a paper towel, I can either take a sponge and blot it. Once it's a little bit more dry, you can see the texture. Or I can take another color and blot it over top of the wet wash. And you can see you get a slightly different texture than the stipple on the wash with the brush. So these are a few different techniques for your watercolor. And you can see with the salt, once the paper is dry, I can brush the salt off. You can see that it is soaking up and absorbing the watercolor where it's just around it. So when I brush these off, you'll be able to see white speckles where there isn't as much watercolor since the salt absorbed it. Hopefully this gives you some basic understandings of all the possibilities with watercolor. Have fun experimenting and test things out.